Most men are not stuck because they lack ability. They are stuck because they are waiting to feel ready. They tell themselves they need more preparation, more clarity, more confidence, a better plan, a stronger version of themselves. They convince themselves that movement must wait until imperfection disappears. But that moment never arrives. Few men realize perfection is often a socially acceptable excuse. It sounds responsible. It sounds disciplined. It even sounds intelligent. But beneath it sits avoidance. Beneath it sits fear disguised as standards. Not ready yet feels safer than failure. Protects identity. Protects ego. It protects reputation. As long as you remain in preparation, you cannot be judged by execution. But safety has a cost. The longer you wait for perfection, the further you drift from momentum. And momentum, not perfection, is what builds competence. This is the uncomfortable truth. You are not stuck because you are incapable. You are stuck because you are protecting yourself from imperfection. And protection, when prolonged, becomes paralysis. Perfection feels safe because it delays exposure. As long as your work remains unfinished, your ability remains unquestioned. Potential is protected from scrutiny. Fear of judgment sits at the center of this mechanism. To act publicly is to risk evaluation. Evaluation threatens identity. The mind prefers the comfort of preparation to the discomfort of criticism. Waiting preserves the illusion of competence. Ego protection reinforces the cycle. When outcomes are uncertain, perfection becomes a shield. If you never release the imperfect version of yourself, you never have to confront inadequacy. You remain the man who could have, rather than the man who tried and failed. Shadow avoidance deepens the resistance. Hidden insecurity, fear of not being exceptional, fear of mediocrity, amplifies hesitation. The shadow whispers that exposure will reveal weakness. Perfection becomes a defense against confronting that fear directly. Comparison culture intensifies the pressure. Surrounded by curated displays of achievement, it becomes tempting to believe that only flawless execution deserves attention. Identity grows fragile in such an environment. Self-worth ties itself to perception rather than process. Contrast growth mindset with image preservation. Growth accepts imperfection as data. Image preservation treats imperfection as threat. One builds through iteration. The other stagnates in anticipation. Few men realize that perfectionism is not discipline. It is controlled avoidance. Recognizing this does not diminish ambition. It clarifies it. The goal is not flawlessness. It is progress under scrutiny. Perfection feels safe because it protects ego. Growth requires risking it. Waiting feels harmless, feels temporary, feels like strategy, but the cost accumulates quietly. Momentum is the first casualty. Action builds rhythm. Rhythm builds confidence. When you postpone execution, that rhythm dissolves. Each delay reinforces hesitation. Movement becomes harder, not easier. Self-trust erodes next. Every time you promise yourself that you will begin soon and fail to follow through, an internal contract weakens. Confidence does not collapse in dramatic moments. It fades through repeated inaction. You begin to doubt not your ability, but your consistency. Opportunity decays while you deliberate. The window you believed would remain open narrows. Conditions change. Competitors move. Circumstances shift. What felt like cautious preparation becomes silent forfeiture. Quiet resentment grows in the background. You observe others advancing while you remain suspended in readiness. Frustration builds, not because they are better, but because they moved. The cost is greater than it appears. Waiting does not preserve potential. It dilutes it. Over time, the identity of almost ready hardens into habit. You become the man who prepares endlessly but executes rarely. Few men recognize that perfectionism extracts payment in momentum, credibility, and opportunity. The erosion is subtle. The consequences are structural. You do not pay immediately. You pay gradually. And gradual losses are the most dangerous because they feel manageable until they become permanent. If waiting erodes momentum, The solution is deceptively simple. Act before you feel ready, not recklessly, not impulsively, but deliberately and imperfectly. Imperfect disciplined action creates behavioral momentum. Action generates movement, and movement reduces resistance. The mind often waits for confidence before acting. In reality, confidence follows action. Few men understand that courage is rarely the starting point. It is the byproduct of repetition. Each imperfect step reinforces identity. When you move despite discomfort, you signal to yourself that you are capable of execution under uncertainty. Identity shifts not through affirmation, but through behavior. The man who acts becomes the man who trusts himself. There is also a psychological principle at work similar to exposure therapy. Avoidance amplifies fear. Controlled exposure reduces it. When you willingly enter discomfort in manageable doses, anxiety loses intensity. The unfamiliar becomes ordinary through contact. Controlled discomfort is the training ground. It recalibrates your tolerance for imperfection. Instead of interpreting unease as danger, you begin to interpret it as growth. Contrast hesitation with motion. Hesitation magnifies doubt. It leaves room for overanalysis and self-critique. Motion interrupts rumination. It narrows focus to execution rather than evaluation. The shift is not dramatic. It is procedural. Act before you feel ready. Deliver before it feels perfect. Publish before it feels complete. Agency returns the moment you move. Fear does not disappear first. It follows. Discipline begins where comfort ends, and progress begins where perfection stops. Motivation feels powerful, but it is unreliable. It rises with inspiration and collapses with discomfort. If your progress depends on feeling ready, energized, or confident, you will move in cycles. Discipline operates differently. Discipline stabilizes behavior independent of mood. It does not wait for emotional alignment. It executes regardless of internal fluctuation. This emotional neutrality is not indifference. It is structural consistency. You act because you decided to, not because you feel like it. Routine over feeling is the decisive shift. When behavior becomes anchored to schedule rather than emotion, volatility loses influence. You stop negotiating with yourself. You remove internal debate. Execution becomes automatic. Action precedes confidence. Many wait to feel capable before moving. In reality, competence grows from repetition. Each completed task reinforces credibility with yourself. Confidence is evidence accumulated over time, not a prerequisite for beginning. Contrast emotional dependency with structured execution. Emotional dependency asks, "Do I feel ready?" Structured execution asks, "Is it time?" One seeks comfort before commitment. The other commits despite discomfort. Few men understand that sovereignty is behavioral, not emotional. When discipline governs your actions, motivation becomes secondary. Identity strengthens when action becomes consistent. Consistency builds trust. Trust builds authority. Discipline does not fluctuate. That is why it wins. Pause and examine your hesitation honestly. What are you postponing? Which project, conversation, decision, or commitment remains suspended under the label of preparation? Look deeper. What are you protecting? Is it time? Is it energy? Or is it identity? Ask yourself directly. Is it failure you fear, or exposure? Is it the outcome that threatens you, or the possibility that you may not perform perfectly? Avoidance rarely announces itself as fear. It disguises itself as caution, strategy, refinement. But refinement can become refuge. Preparation can become concealment. Few men confront avoidance honestly. It requires admitting that the barrier is internal. It requires recognizing that delay is often self-protection rather than prudence. Notice the patterns. Where do you stall? Where do you promise action and then retreat? What narrative do you tell yourself to justify waiting? Ownership begins here. Not in grand declarations, but in acknowledging resistance. You cannot move beyond the struggle if you refuse to identify it. Avoidance thrives in vagueness. Discipline begins with clarity. The question is not whether you are capable. It is whether you are willing to act despite imperfection. Grand resolutions often collapse under their own weight. Micro-commitments endure. Small daily execution is underestimated because it lacks drama. It does not feel transformative in the moment. But transformation rarely begins with intensity. It begins with repetition. A single disciplined action, performed consistently, compounds quietly. Consistency over intensity creates durability. Intensity spikes motivation briefly, then fades. Consistency builds structure. When you commit to manageable actions each day, writing a page, training for 30 minutes, making one difficult call, you train reliability into your identity. Identity is not formed by aspiration. It is formed by repeated behavior. The man who executes daily begins to see himself differently. He no longer identifies as someone preparing to act. He identifies as someone who acts. Action reshapes self-concept through evidence. Each completed task reinforces a narrative. I move when I decide to move. That narrative strengthens self-trust. Self-trust reduces hesitation. Reduced hesitation accelerates progress. Few men recognize that discipline grows from modest commitments sustained over time. They search for monumental breakthroughs while neglecting daily structure. Long-term thinking reframes urgency. You do not need to overhaul your life in a single week. You need to demonstrate consistency in the smallest units of time available. Micro-commitments appear ordinary. Their accumulation is not. The disciplined man is not defined by intensity. He is defined by repetition. And repetition builds identity stronger than ambition ever could. Your future does not require flawless execution. It requires decision. Out from the individual and observe the environment shaping him. We live in a culture that rewards performance over progress. Social media perfection presents curated identities polished for public approval. Mistakes are edited out. Struggle is hidden. Imperfection appears rare. In such an atmosphere, visible imperfection feels dangerous. Comparison intensifies hesitation. When every timeline displays finished results, starting imperfectly feels like exposure. Curated identity encourages projection rather than growth. Men become preoccupied with how they appear rather than how they improve. Performance replaces process. Attention replaces advancement. Contrast this performative culture with the disciplined minority. While many polish presentation, a smaller group commits to progress. They accept that improvement is gradual and often unglamorous. They tolerate awkward beginnings because they value development over display. Few recognize how much this environment amplifies perfectionism. It conditions men to fear visible struggle. Yet progress is inherently visible struggle. Seriousness emerges when you reject performance as priority. Progress does not seek applause. It seeks repetition. In a culture obsessed with appearance, disciplined execution becomes rare, and rarity once again builds power. There is a distinct difference between the man who waits and the man who moves. The one who waits searches for certainty. The one who moves accepts discomfort as part of the process. The man who acts before comfort does not interpret unease as a signal to retreat. He recognizes it as friction generated by growth. His decisions are guided by structure rather than feeling. He understands that readiness is rarely emotional. It is behavioral. He tolerates imperfection without collapsing into self-critique. Early attempts may lack refinement, but they create evidence. Evidence builds confidence. Confidence reduces hesitation. The cycle strengthens itself. He builds publicly, not for attention, but for accountability. Visibility sharpens execution. It removes the illusion of endless preparation. Each imperfect action becomes a step forward rather than a reason to retreat. Momentum compounds quietly. One action leads to another. Small commitments accumulate into visible change. Over time, what once felt uncomfortable becomes routine. Routine becomes identity. Few men understand that authority grows from motion. The man who moves anyway reshapes himself through repetition. He does not wait to feel complete. It progresses through incompleteness. Sovereignty is not perfection. It is disciplined movement under uncertainty. And movement, once sustained, becomes unstoppable. We return to the beginning. You do not need perfection. You need movement. Perfection promises safety. Movement creates progress. The difference between the two determines whether you remain in preparation or enter momentum. Most men wait for confidence. They wait for clarity. They wait for the absence of doubt. A doubt does not vanish before action. It fades through repetition. Readiness is not an emotional state. It is a decision. Just do this. Act before you feel prepared. Deliver before it feels complete. Begin before the internal voice grants permission. Each time you move despite imperfection, you rewrite identity. You prove to yourself that hesitation does not control you. Self-trust strengthens. Discipline stabilizes. Confidence follows quietly. The cost of waiting is hidden erosion. The reward of action is visible momentum. Start before you feel ready. Allow discomfort. Tolerate imperfection. Let repetition refine what courage begins. Authority is not built through flawless execution. It is built through consistent movement under uncertainty. You do not need a better version of yourself to begin. You become better by beginning. Beyond the struggle, where discipline replaces impulse and clarity replaces chaos.